Namaskar. Good morning. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for this beautiful song, which perfectly expresses my own inner feelings on a Sunday like this. Our theme for today is the way of self-enquiry, from the ego to the self. As you know, the aim of Vedanta is to help us recover our true but forgotten identity by getting rid of false notions of ourselves. It is like unmasking ourselves or unmasking our self, if you will. How does Vedanta do it? That will be the subject of this talk. Our everyday lives are lived almost wholly on the physical and mental levels. Our experiences are confined to objects and ideas. Our sense of self is limited by factors like the body, sense organs, mind, and ego. These virtually make up our average existence, and we doubt the reality of anything beyond. But as long as we equate ourselves with these things, we can't perceive anything subtler. In our daily practical lives, we only deal with shadows. It is these shadows that Vedanta asks us to negate. Vedanta says that the individualization of the self is not real. It's an illusion created by ignorance. The self is perfectly unattached. It cannot be related to the objective world except through delusion. And because the very idea of individuality is a product of delusion, it ceases to exist when the delusion is destroyed by the true knowledge of the self. Because of ignorance, the rope appears to be a snake, and it continues to be perceived as such so long as the ignorance lasts. But when the true nature of the rope is seen, the idea of the snake disappears. When ignorance is destroyed by right knowledge, all notions of the self's individualization cease to exist. Just as the dream ego, functioning in sleep, ceases to exist or vanishes when the dreamer awakes. The self is the only existing reality. It cannot by any means become individualized, because the idea of individuality does not exist from the self's standpoint. There cannot be any real connection between the self and individuality, just as there can't be any point of contact between the desert and the mirage. The water of a mirage is illusory. It cannot soak a single grain of sand in the desert. So, what happens when everything, all objects and ideas, including our own imaginary personalities, are negated as unreal? It may be argued that when the process of negation is carried to its logical conclusion, one finds an utter absence of everything. What remains is a void. So the ultimate reality is a void or non-existence. But Vedantic logic goes further. Every act of negation does leave behind a remainder. When the snake is negated, the rope remains. And when the rope is negated, something else remains. After all the changing superimpositions have been removed, what remains is not void, but pure being, existence itself. When all objects and ideas have disappeared, what stands in their place is not emptiness, but pure consciousness, the perceiver of the void or emptiness, and that is the real self. As a matter of fact, Vedanta holds that only after this kind of negation can one realize the pure attributeless self, the witness of all the modifications of relativity and also of their absence. It could be called the contentless consciousness, in which both subject and object merge and disappear. It cannot be void for one solid reason. A person emerging from the experience of the self is full of knowledge and wisdom, peace and blessedness, full of love and compassion. This couldn't have resulted from an experience of the void. This self is the individualized soul's real essence. When the soul discovers this, it discards all limitations and realizes its true nature, just as a river entering the ocean gives up name and form and finds its real source and ultimate goal. Now, what is the process by which one recovers one's real identity? According to Vedanta, the true nature of the self is discovered through the method of negation, a method in which one systematically refutes all phenomena as illusory until one arrives at self-knowledge. Vedanta says, just as a snake seen in a rope is in the end, that is to say, after proper investigation, found to be nothing but the rope, in the same way, the unreal individuality superimposed upon the real self is realized in the end to be nothing but the self. Now, before proceeding any further, let us be clear about what exactly negation means, or there will be much unnecessary misunderstanding. It is not the relative reality of our personality that is denied. That reality, which is also based on the self, does surely exist, but only for the time being. What is actually negated is the wrong idea, which springs from ignorance, that this personality of name and form is absolutely real in itself, independent of the self. Now we can move on to a more detailed description of the method of negation. There are two great Vedic statements through the contemplation of which the mind is led from the false personality of name and form to the self that underlies them. You know them, Tat Tvam Asi and Aham Brahmasmi. That thou art and I am Brahman. Both these statements point to the same fact, that is, the ultimate and essential oneness of an individual soul and God, the universal soul, because the reality behind them both is Brahman, or pure consciousness. Let us try to understand the meaning of the first statement, that thou art. The word that has two meanings, a direct meaning and an implied meaning. Directly, that stands for the conditioned Brahman, not the supreme Brahman, Saguna Brahman. That's Tat denotes the Saguna Brahman, who is associated with the universe as its creator, preserver, and destroyer, and who is endowed with omniscience, omnipotence, lordship, and such other attributes, plus pure consciousness, which underlies both Saguna Brahman and the universe. That is to say, the direct meaning of the word that is the conditioned Brahman with attributes, that is God, the universal soul. But the implied meaning of that is pure consciousness unassociated with any limiting factor of Maya, and which is the substratum of both God and the universe. Likewise, the word thou also has two meanings, a direct and an implied. Directly, thou stands for the individualized soul associated with an individual body characterized by such limitations as birth and death, hunger and thirst, pain and pleasure, and endowed with limited knowledge, limited power, limited freedom, and other similar traits, together with pure consciousness, which underlies all this. That is to say, the direct meaning of thou is the individual soul, but the implied meaning is, again, pure consciousness unassociated with any limiting factor of Maya, and which is also the substratum of the individual soul. And the word art in the statement conveys the identity of that and thou. That is simple. Now, what do we do when the direct meaning of a statement does not agree with actual fact? Then we have to interpret in terms of its implied, that is to say, its hidden or unspoken meaning. It's obvious that and thou are characterized by contradictory attributes. They cannot be identical from the standpoint of direct meaning, that is to say, in a literal sense. Ishvara differs from the jiva as the sun differs from a firefly or a mountain from a mustard seed. Yet, their identity is a fact realized through the direct and immediate experience of the sages. Therefore, this identity is explained from the standpoint of implied meaning. Vedanta philosophers reason that the contrasting attributes which distinguish Ishvara and Jiva are not ultimately real, but are due to superimposition. It is through ignorance that pure consciousness appears to have become God in the universe. Through ignorance, again, the same pure consciousness appears to have become the jiva, having a body. The superimpositions are all temporary and illusory. Their substratum or underlying basis, that alone is real. It is pure consciousness alone that is the substratum of both Ishvara and Jiva. When the false superimpositions are eliminated through negation, one realizes by direct experience that the ultimate reality is pure consciousness and neither Ishvara nor Jiva. After explaining the meaning of this great Vedic statement, Tat Tvam Asi, the teacher encourages the seeker to meditate on his real essence. Now I'll quote 10 beautiful verses from the Viveka Chudamani, how the Guru instructs a competent disciple in the Jnana Marga. The Guru says, that which is beyond the personality, which is without name and form, that which transcends space and time and sense objects, you are that Brahman. Meditate on this in your mind. That which is free from birth, growth, maturity, decline, infirmity, and death, that which is indestructible, that which is the cause of the projection, sustenance, and dissolution of the universe. You are that Brahman. Meditate on this in your mind. That which is free from duality, that which is infinite, supreme, eternal, and undying, that which is taintless, you are that Brahman. Meditate on this in your mind. That beyond which there is nothing, which shines above Maya and is infinitely greater than the universe, the inmost self of all, the one without a second, Sat Chit Ananda, infinite and immutable, you are that Brahman. Meditate on this in your mind. When the seeker hears these lofty teachings, he begins to reflect on their meaning. He exercises his reason and understands that the teacher's words are true. Then he meditates on Brahman with unshakable faith and single-minded devotion. Gradually, he rids himself of all superimpositions due to which he had identified himself with transitory things and clung to notions of I and mine. First, he stops paying undue attention to the physical body. Then he purifies himself by constant contemplation. And finally, succeeds in discovering the pure self which lay covered by the impurities of endless desires. The more his mind is established in the self, the less it is attracted to the outside world. And when all desires have been totally eliminated, there takes place the uninterrupted vision of the self. So this is how the seeker learns the precise meaning of the statement, that thou art. Rejecting the attributes wrongly superimposed upon that and thou, one understands that the statement refers to the absolute oneness of the individual self and the supreme self, which is experienced on the plane of pure consciousness. As one meditates on one's unity with Brahman, it is said, there arises in the mind a state, a wave, a vritti, which makes one feel that one is the self-luminous Brahman. This mental state is said to be illumined by the reflection of pure consciousness, and it gradually destroys the aspirant's ignorance and doubts regarding Brahman. But even now, Brahman is still a state or wave in the mind. When the ignorance is destroyed, its effects, the various mental states, are also destroyed. Just as when a piece of cloth is burnt, its warp and woof are also burnt. So, when ignorance is destroyed, the mental state colored by Brahman, which is also part of the effects of ignorance, is also destroyed. When this last mental state or wave is destroyed, then what happens? It is not that everything vanishes into nothingness. There remains only the consciousness that was reflected in that state. Vedanta philosophers say this tiny bit of consciousness, being unable to illumine the supreme self-luminous Brahman, becomes overpowered by it. This is how the philosophers, the Vedanta teachers, technically try to make things as clear as possible. But this is something that has to be experienced. When the final mental state is destroyed, that tiny bit of consciousness reverts to Brahman. Actually, this so-called state is a state beyond all states. It is a state beyond description. It is like the image of a face in a mirror. When the mirror is taken away, the reflection reverts to the face itself. Or like the reflection of the sun in a dish of water. When the dish is removed, it reverts to the sun. Briefly, what happens is, when meditation deepens, the mind, which is, after all, an effect of ignorance, maya, and a form of matter, that is destroyed, and in the absence of the reflecting medium, the Brahman that was reflected in the mind gets absorbed into the Supreme Brahman. And that Supreme Brahman alone shines now. This is how the subject and the object, pure consciousness and the perceiving or individualized consciousness, become one. When the duality is removed, there remains only the Supreme Brahman, one without the second. So this is how the knowledge of Brahman thoroughly destroys all false superimpositions which accounted for the seeker's individuality. Realizing within oneself the infinite and eternal Brahman, which is ever pure, ever illumined, ever free, the seeker is liberated forever, liberated from ignorance, from delusion, fear, grief, death. One becomes the embodiment of supreme bliss. This is the state where one says, I am Brahman, aham brahmasmi. The teacher had said, Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art. And now the seeker confirms it. Yes, I am Brahman, aham brahmasmi. This ultimate experience is utterly indescribable in words. As I said, it is known only to one who has experienced it, one who has attained it. So this, in brief, is the Vedanta way of self-enquiry. Now we move to the next part, the journey from the ego to the self. As spiritual seekers, we are all on a spiritual journey, a journey towards self-discovery. The journey begins with the unreal self, the ego, and ends with the discovery of the real self, the Atman. So the ego and the Atman stand at two opposite ends of our spiritual journey. Broadly speaking, the ego is that part of the mind which expresses individuality. It is the ego that gives us the sense of I and mine. The ego is the mouthpiece of the personality, so to say. The total personality is, of course, a very complex thing. It is not easy to understand how deep its roots are. Various factors, the body, the senses, the prana, the mind, the ahankara, the ego, all of them together make up the total personality. But as far as its medium of expression is concerned, there is not much difficulty in understanding what it is. It is the ego. It is something that is always present in our day-to-day lives. Every moment of our lives, we are keenly conscious of ourselves as individuals, separate from other individuals. When we think or speak or do anything, we know that the ego, our I sense, is present. As a rule, there can't be any activity, physical or mental, without the sense of individuality in the background. So the ego's role in our everyday lives can hardly be exaggerated. It is the master player of our present mental plane. It is the thread that pulls together all the different elements of the personality and gives us a sense of unity and cohesion. Now, when the ego functions, it associates itself with a wide variety of objects. By itself, it's a neutral entity, but this neutrality ends in the field of operation. The ego has to identify with something, otherwise it cannot express itself. For example, the ego has to identify itself with the body. Then I say, I am healthy or unhealthy, tall or short, fair or dark. When I say, I am thinking, my ego has attached itself to the mind. When I say I am angry, the emotion of anger has become the object of association. Even when we speak of certain ethical or cultural or social attributes, even then the ego is there with its corresponding assertions. I'm a virtuous person, I'm an accomplished artist, I'm a responsible citizen, and so on and so forth. It has only changed its focus of identification, and that is all. So, the ego in action changes from moment to moment. This moment it is linked with a certain function of the body, and the next moment with the state of the mind, and later with an external circumstance. There is no limit to the objects or ideas with which the ego can connect itself. In all these various identifications, the ego has a definite idea of what it is connecting itself with. But there are some extraordinary instances where the identification is only implicit. So, our understanding of it is also not clear. The ego can identify itself with ideas of infinity and eternity, though it is not fully conscious of this fact. For example, we implicitly believe that we are all immortal. all our thoughts and actions betray this strong assumption that we will never die, that we will live forever. But this belief is not clearly recognized. It is something that is subconsciously assumed. In the same way, the ego sometimes feels, senses rather, an immense vastness or a great awareness or a profound tranquility that are not of the ordinary kind. We don't readily understand them. And normally, we lack the inclination or the patience or the courage to deeply ponder our kinship with these spiritual phenomena. But there is nevertheless an implicit identification with them at the back of our consciousness, which we cannot shake off. In fact, if we did not have this kind of cosmic or this immense, vast ego identification, life here would be miserable. We couldn't survive if every moment we feared death, or every moment we were conscious of limitation, suffering, and ignorance. Luckily for us, there is in us this natural identification of the ego with the infinite and eternal, however hidden, however ununderstood, or however occasional it is. The identification is not clear in ordinary consciousness because it is superficial. It doesn't go deeply enough into the personality. We often use the word personality, but somehow we don't care to discover its foundations. We don't fully know what the mind is. We humans have deeper levels of existence than the personality and the mind. Though in daily life, it may not be necessary to analyze or understand them. Now, this implicit or instinctive identification of the ego with the infinite and eternal points to a very significant fact, that there is a common basic reality behind both the individual personality and the universe. And this reality Vedanta calls the real self, Atman or Brahman. That self is the core of the mind and personality. It is also the core of the external world that we perceive. When we probe deeply enough, we and the universe become one. The self is that unity. We live and move in that unity. We can't get away from our own true nature. We are generally preoccupied with this superficial personality, but there is always an unknown element of our existence which the ego occasionally senses. Some people, in certain rare moments of their lives, do feel its presence, and they say they have experienced it as a state of timelessness, or as pure awareness, or as a deep calmness. It's not easy for even them to describe it, but they can't deny the reality of their experience. Certain philosophers, psychologists, and even physicists have spoken and written about this phenomena. Anyhow, what I'm trying to say is, just as in ordinary life, the ego is the mouthpiece of the personality, the instrument by which the personality can work and manifest itself, in the same way, in the field of spiritual inquiry, the ego serves as a pointer to the true basis of that personality, which is the self. The first role of the ego, we all understand. The second role, that of the pointer, that has to be recognized by constant analysis and discernment. Many people never even have a clue that there is a vast reality in the background of their lives. Perhaps they have had no opportunity for introspection. For them, the self remains unknown and undiscovered, perhaps for lives. The desire to look deeply into life depends on a person's temperament and accumulated mental tendencies, samskaras. For those who take the question of spiritual life seriously, the self or reality, the ground, the very ground of our existence, that cannot be allowed to remain unrecognized and undiscovered. The highest goal of spiritual life is to realize that ultimate ground, to know that at all times we are one with everything that exists. Of course, we have to begin with the ego. But our goal is to go forward until the ego discovers the true self. The primary function of the ego is to identify itself with this and that. The ego can't help it. We have to be patient with this nature of the ego, but at the same time, we have to train it so that its tendency of identification is directed to supersensuous things. It has to be taught to associate itself with God. Then the ego learns to call itself, as Sri Ramakrishna wanted, the child of God or the servant of God. The ego seeks relationships. It becomes restless if it is left alone. So the object of spiritual training is to give the ego spiritual relationships. Sri Ramakrishna used to speak of two kinds of egos, the ripe and the unripe. The ego that says, I am the child of God, I am the servant of God, that is the ripe ego. The unripe ego is that which attaches itself to different ideas and objects of worldly enjoyment. It says, I am beautiful, I am powerful, I am wealthy. These identifications may be necessary in everyday life, but in the context of the highest spiritual goal, they become barriers. When I say, I am the body, I have covered my true self with a veil. That is why Sri Ramakrishna said the point of spiritual life is to gradually transform the unripe ego to a ripe one. Whenever I do some work, I normally say, I am doing this. This is the expression of the unripe ego. I can do the same work with a shift in the ego's outlook. I can also say, this body which does the work is God's tool. God is the doer. As St. Paul famously said, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. Now the ego has become transformed. It has become the ripe ego. So there can't be self-knowledge if the ego is left to its ignorant ways, sometimes identifying with this and sometimes with that. each identification becomes a binding link chaining us to this relative existence, and the experience of our true nature remains far away. Now we come to something very interesting. Sometimes, whenever we want to emphasize something, we say, I myself have done this. We are using two terms. One is the I, the ordinary ego. But what is this self in myself? Normally, we don't think about why we use these two terms. We also say, you yourself told me this. And we also use the third person and say, he himself had come here. So what does the word self in these three expressions, these three statements imply? The Vedanta analysis says the I, the ego, has only one face. It can only be expressed in the first person. But the self is common to all three persons. It has three faces. It is behind that person, behind you, and behind me. And this is the common consciousness behind all personalities. It is undeniable and immediately experienced. Everything is ultimately rooted in the self, in that eternal truth. Our minds, our lives, our world, everything, though we don't ordinarily recognize this. We sometimes have only an implicit intuition of it. When we consciously try to discover this self, that implicit intuition becomes more and more explicit, vivid. We become more conscious of our spiritual nature, and it becomes easier to give up old, false identifications. Because of ignorance, we've been accustomed to saying, I'm a man, or I'm a woman, or I'm Mr. or Miss so-and-so. In order to break that habit, we have to start asserting, I'm a servant of God. I am one with God. I am one with all. I am Satchit Ananda. It is said that as one's spiritual understanding matures and as the experience of the self becomes more explicit, one finds that this experience has nothing to do with any kind of objective association, nothing to do with name and form. That is why in higher Vedanta practices, the method often used is that of negation. Positive identification is necessary up to a certain stage. After that, the ego has to be taught to forget its old habit of identification and instead to practice disidentification. Mano buddhi ahankara chittani na aham. I am not these things. The ego has to be trained to dissociate itself from whatever ideas of attachment come into the mind. This is, of course, an extremely difficult task, but if we gradually train the ego, first through spiritual identification, calling ourselves or referring ourselves as God's children or God's servants, then it will become sufficiently pure, sufficiently detached to take up these higher negating practices. The experience of the self is quite different from the experience of the ego. It doesn't have to take the form of I am. This is something that I found this idea in, I can't readily recall, in one of Ashokanandaji's lectures. It couldn't have been anybody else. He says, it doesn't have to take the form of I am. For the sake of contemplation, we have to use such language as I am of the nature of pure Sat-Chit Ananda. But in actual experience, Maharaj says, in actual experience, there is no question of I. You must have experienced it. The actual experience cannot be described in the language of the ego. Why? Because the self is not something that stands outside of myself. The self is my own nature, my own true nature, the eternal subject of all experience. We cannot express the self as an idea or in words in the way we express a concept or describe an external object. That is why Vedanta says, neti, neti, not this, not this. The self can never be known as I know an external object. The seeker is the self. When the veil of ego identification is removed, the seeker finds that the self was always there. Though the ego can point to the self is in fact revealed by its own true nature. And that experience is indescribable. Now, what happens when self-knowledge arises? What is the gain? Vedanta says that when one realizes one's true nature, one finds that the self is not confined within one single body. This is also again Ashokanandaji's. When one realizes one's true nature, one finds that the self is not confined within one single body. A person of self-knowledge finds that the self is all-pervading consciousness. It is everywhere. Wherever we turn, the self is there. That means that the self is the substratum, the ground, not only of the individual personality, but also of everything that we experience. Even time and space are contained in that self. There is an analogy which we find in Sri Ramakrishna's Gospel. He says, you will understand God's nature better as you approach Him nearer and nearer. And he gives the illustration of an ocean which looks blue from far away, but as you approach it, and finally when you scoop a handful of water, it is colorless. It is something like that. So Yatishwaranandaji also says, our ideas of God depend on our ideas of ourselves. The more spiritual we become, the better we understand God's real nature. It is all the same thing said in different ways. So, to conclude, the Upanishad says, one who knows the self goes beyond all ignorance and limitation and becomes absolutely free and blissful. That is the gain. One who seeks this, reflects on this, and understands this, delights in the self, sports with the self, rejoices in the self, revels in the self. Such a one becomes one's own master and enjoys unlimited freedom. So that is the gain. When one is rid of ignorance, the unreal ego dies and the true self shines forth. That is the state attained through self-knowledge, and That is our goal, our ultimate destination. Thank you. Yeah, now I have two announcements to make. Next week, we'll be hosting our beloved Nirakaranandaji. Nirakaranandaji, on his way back to St. Louis from India, will be stopping here. He's arriving on Saturday, I think, and he will give next Sunday's talk, and it will be on a very interesting subject. It is the sadhana of giving. The sadhana of giving. So please make sure that you don't miss that. Of course, he's such a pleasant person to be with also. Yeah, and his talks are really, he's a really engaging speaker. That is one. And as we do it every year, I'm now placing this sheet outside. This is those who want to join in this chanting of Jai Shri Durga. We do it every year. They can enter their names here. It begins on Wednesday, 2nd October, and it will go on for 10 days until Saturday, the 12th of October. So whoever is interested, please put your names, phone numbers, and how many repetitions you will be able to make. All those particulars are here, and this sheet I'll place outside now. And now we have plenty of good food waiting. So all of you, I welcome all of you to please join us in the basement and enjoy the lunch. Yeah.
One question can be asked. Anyway, when we know this theoretically, what you talked about, how can we practice something of that without, can we practice it, not even with realization, with love amongst the
Can you be a little specific?
Okay, I'm in a community, and there I want to be able to see self in all kinds of people.
The easier way is, as we just heard, first to bring God in between. Yeah, think of yourself as God's child and the people that you serve as God's children. Spiritualize the ego before you rid it of all other associations. That is the easier way of doing it. That is something we can do. Yeah, that is Sri Ramakrishna's. Yes, that is what we can do. But the thing is, the problem with most of us is we lack the stamina to continue this over long durations. That is what we lack, the strength. Especially, see, when everything is going well with my life, all these things are okay. When external circumstances are very, very conducive, it is easy. But what happens when I'm face to face with temptation? What happens when I'm beaten by suffering? That is when we lose. That is when we become weak. I think it is good to make use of the idea of personal impersonal, thinking of ourselves and our spiritual ideal as a combination of these things. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, why do you bother so much about these technicalities? Do what you can sincerely. If you are sincere, pray to God. God will teach you. God, see, for us, those things are very theoretical. Sri Ramakrishna says, I myself, amito mukkho, I'm a fool. But I prayed to Mother, and Mother showed me everything. Yet this faith we don't have.